The wizarding world of Harry Potter doesn't just give us magic and wonder, it presents some of literature's most psychologically complex villains. From childhood trauma to pure evil, these dark wizards represent mental disorders and personality flaws taken to their most dangerous extremes. And the most disturbing part? Many of their psychological motivations mirror real-world patterns of abuse, manipulation, and power. Number 15. Gilderoy Lockhart, narcissistic personality disorder, and memory manipulation. Kenneth Branagh's Gilderoy Lockhart represents the psychology of someone whose narcissism is so extreme that he literally steals other people's achievements and erases their memories to maintain his false image. Lockhart's psychology stems from his desperate need for admiration and recognition, combined with complete lack of actual competence. His memory charms aren't just crimes, they're psychological tools to maintain his delusions of grandeur. What makes his psychology dangerous is how he's willing to destroy other people's identities to preserve his own false narrative. His victims don't just lose credit for their achievements, they lose pieces of themselves. His complete breakdown when confronted with real danger shows how narcissistic personalities collapse when their false competence is exposed to genuine challenges. Number 14. Cornelius Fudge, denial psychology and political self-preservation. Robert Hardy's Cornelius Fudge represents the psychology of willful ignorance and political denial when faced with inconvenient truths that threaten personal power and status. Fudge's psychology shows how people in authority can become so invested in maintaining their position, deny obvious reality rather than admit they're unprepared for a crisis. What makes his psychology realistic and frustrating is how his denial isn't based on stupidity. It's based on the psychological inability to accept information that would require him to admit failure or inadequacy. His persecution of Harry and Dumbledore shows how denial can transform into active hostility toward anyone who threatens comfortable illusions. Number 13. Lucius Malfoy, aristocratic supremacy and cowardly opportunism. Jason Isaacs' Lucius Malfoy represents the psychology of inherited privilege combined with cowardice disguised as cunning. His supremacist beliefs mask deep insecurity about his own worth. Malfoy's psychology stems from his need to maintain social status and family honor, making him willing to align with any powerful force that preserves his position in the hierarchy. What makes his psychology contemptible is how he uses his son as a tool for his own ambitions, while simultaneously putting Draco in danger through his Death Eater activities. His quick abandonment to Voldemort when the tide turns shows how his supremacist beliefs are really just opportunistic self-preservation disguised as ideology. Number 12. Fenrir Greyback, predatory psychology and infection compulsion. Dave Legeno's Fenrir Greyback represents the psychology of a predator who's found a way to literally transform his victims into versions of himself, creating the ultimate expression of abusive cycle perpetuation. Greyback psychology shows how some predators are motivated not just by violence, but by the desire to corrupt innocents and create more predators like themselves. His targeting of children reveals the psychology of someone who understands that trauma inflicted early creates the most lasting damage and the highest likelihood of creating future predators. What makes his psychology particularly disturbing is how he's weaponizing his lycanthropy into a tool for psychological and physical corruption of others. Number 11. Barty Crouch Jr., daddy issues and fanatical devotion. David Tennant's Barty Crouch Jr. represents the psychology of someone whose relationship with an authoritarian father creates such rebellion that he becomes fanatically devoted to the father's greatest enemy. His psychology shows how children of rigid, emotionally absent parents can develop such intense need for approval that they'll seek it from anyone who offers validation, even dark wizards. What makes his psychology tragic is how his year-long impersonation of Mad-Eye Moody shows genuine teaching ability and connection with students, suggesting he could have been a positive force if he'd received proper guidance. His devotion to Voldemort represents displaced filial loyalty. He gives the Dark Lord the devotion he could never give his father. Number 10. Draco Malfoy, inherited prejudice and moral awakening. Tom Felton's Draco Malfoy represents the psychology of someone raised in supremacist ideology who gradually realizes the moral bankruptcy of his family's beliefs when faced with real consequences. Draco psychology shows how children can inherit their parents' prejudices without understanding their true implications until they're forced to act on them personally. His breakdown in the sixth film reveals someone whose conscience is fighting against his upbringing. creating internal conflict between family loyalty and moral recognition. What makes his psychology compelling is how his cowardice becomes a form of moral awakening. His inability to kill Dumbledore shows that his humanity survived his indoctrination. Number 9. Dolores Umbridge, Authoritarian Sadism and Bureaucratic Cruelty. Imelda Staunton's Dolores Umbridge represents the psychology of someone who uses institutional authority to inflict cruelty while maintaining a facade of propriety and rule following. Umbridge's psychology shows how some people are drawn to positions of power specifically because they enjoy controlling and punishing others, especially those who can't fight back. Her use of torture disguised as detention reveals someone who's found a way to satisfy sadistic impulses while maintaining plausible deniability through institutional authority. What makes her psychology particularly disturbing is how she genuinely believes her cruelty is justified and necessary, showing how institutional power can corrupt moral reasoning. This one hits different because we've all encountered authority figures who abuse their power. Umbridge's psychology is terrifyingly recognizable. Have you ever dealt with someone like her? Let me know in the comments below. Number 8. Peter Pettigrew, Cowardice and Betrayal Psychology. Timothy Spall's Peter Pettigrew represents the psychology of someone whose cowardice and need for protection makes him willing to betray anyone, including his closest friends. Pettigrew's psychology shows how some people are so driven by fear and self-preservation that they'll sacrifice others to protect themselves, even when those others have shown them nothing but loyalty. His transformation into a rat for 12 years represents both literal and metaphorical hiding from the consequences of his betrayal, showing how guilt can drive people into psychological isolation. What makes his psychology tragic is how his fear becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. His betrayal of James and Lily creates the very danger he was trying to avoid. Number 7. Grindelwald, Charismatic Extremism and Utilitarian Evil. Johnny Depp and Mads Mikkelsen Grindelwald represents the psychology of someone who uses genuine charisma and intellectual brilliance to justify genocidal ideology through utilitarian philosophy. Grindelwald's psychology operates on the belief that wizard supremacy would create a better world for everyone, making his genocide feel altruistic rather than purely evil. His relationship with Dumbledore shows how shared trauma and intellectual connection can create bonds that survive even fundamental moral disagreements. What makes his psychology dangerous is how he uses logical arguments and genuine concern for wizard welfare to justify actions that are clearly monstrous. Number 6. Severus Snape, Obsessive Love and Redemptive Hatred. Alan Rickman's Severus Snape represents the psychology of someone whose unrequited love becomes so obsessive that it defines every major decision for the rest of his life. Snape's psychology shows how childhood trauma and social rejection can create someone whose capacity for love becomes twisted into possessive obsession and vindictive hatred. His treatment of Harry reveals someone who can't separate the inner child from his father, showing how unresolved psychological wounds can corrupt even protective instincts. What makes his psychology complex is how his love for Lily motivates both his worst and best actions. The same obsession that makes him cruel also makes him heroic. Number 5. Dementors, Depression, Manifestation, and Despair Psychology. The Dementors represent the psychology of clinical depression made manifest. Creatures that literally feed on happiness and hope while leaving their victims with nothing but their worst memories. Their psychology operates on the principle that joy and hope are finite resources that can't be drained, leaving only despair and the inability to experience positive emotions. What makes their psychology terrifying is how their presence doesn't just cause sadness. It makes people unable to remember that happiness is possible, mirroring the cognitive distortions of severe depression. Their Dementor's kiss represents the ultimate expression of psychological destruction, the removal of the soul itself, leaving only an empty shell. Number 4. Bellatrix Lestrange, Sadistic Devotion and Torture Psychology. Helena Bonham Carter's Bellatrix Lestrange represents the psychology of someone whose devotion to Voldemort becomes so extreme that torture and murder become expressions of religious ecstasy. Bellatrix's psychology shows how fanatical devotion can transform someone into a sadist who genuinely enjoys inflicting pain because she believes it serves a higher purpose. Her use of the Cruciatus Curse reveals someone who's found a way to combine her natural sadism with her ideological beliefs, making torture feel like worship. What makes her psychology terrifying is how her devotion to Voldemort gives her a framework for unlimited cruelty while maintaining her sense of righteousness. Number 3. Tom Riddle, Young Voldemort, Psychopathic Development and Charm Manipulation. Christian Coulson and Frank Delane's young Tom Riddle represents the psychology of a developing psychopath whose charm and intelligence mask complete absence of empathy or conscience. Riddle's psychology shows how some people are born without the capacity for genuine human connection, making them capable of manipulating others without any emotional investment in their welfare. His ability to charm teachers and students while secretly torturing animals and manipulating classmates shows the classic psychopath pattern of surface charm hiding predatory behavior. What makes his psychology chilling is how his transformation into Voldemort isn't corruption. It's the natural evolution of someone who was never capable of love or empathy. Number 2. Voldemort, Fear of Death and Immortality Obsession. Ralph Fiennes' Voldemort represents the psychology of someone whose fear of death becomes so extreme that he's willing to destroy his own humanity to achieve immortality. Voldemort's psychology stems from his inability to accept mortality, leading him to fragment his soul through murder to create Horcruxes that ensure his survival. His complete inability to understand love or sacrifice shows how his fear of death has eliminated every human emotion except hatred and the desire for control. What makes his psychology tragic is how his quest for immortality makes him less human with each Horcrux, until he becomes something that's barely alive despite being unable to die. This one's existentially terrifying. Voldemort's fear of death is universal, but his solution destroys everything that makes life worth living. Would immortality be worth losing your humanity? Let me know your thoughts. Number 1. The Horcrux System, Fragmented Soul Psychology. The concept of Horcruxes represents the most psychologically disturbing element in the Harry Potter universe. The idea that evil actions can literally fragment the human soul until nothing recognizably human remains. The psychology of soul fragmentation shows how each act of murder doesn't just harm the victim, it damages the perpetrator's capacity for human connection and emotional experience. What makes Horcrux psychology terrifying is how it suggests that evil isn't just moral choice. It's psychological self-destruction that becomes irreversible after enough damage. The process of creating Horcruxes represents the ultimate expression of narcissism, choosing personal survival over human connection, even when that survival comes at the cost of everything that makes survival meaningful. Harry's accidental Horcrux status shows how trauma and evil can be transmitted to innocent victims, but also how love and sacrifice can heal even the most severe psychological damage.